Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Frontline Dispatches from Organizing Upgrade, a show that's dedicated to spotlighting the most urgent left organizing and activism happening across the country. And stay tuned for future episodes every day on Wednesday at 4 p.m. Pacific time. That's 6 p.m. Central time and 7 p.m. Eastern time. I'm your host today, Xiomara Corpeño. And wanted to say hello and welcome our guest for today, Odilia Romero, with Comunidades Indigenas en Liderazgo. Welcome, Odilia.
Hi, Xiomara. Good to see you. Thank you for having me in Frontline Dispatches.
Thank you so much for joining us. For folks who have not joined us before, we urge you to please like us on Facebook and on YouTube. And we also want to encourage folks to send us a message. If you're watching live right now, you can hit the chat button, ask us questions or make comments, and we will get to them during the interview. Odilia, through you and the work that I have been able to witness over the last couple of years under your leadership, you talk a lot about indigenous migrants being invisibilized in the U.S. Can you tell us a little bit about how that invisibilization happens around indigenous migrants?
Well, through the work that we do, we see these invisibilization of indigenous people. They have a death or life consequence, the freedom of somebody, the deportation of someone. As indigenous people, we are labeled or categorized as Latinos or Mexicans. And when we are labeled as Latinos and Mexicans, and of course, in the case of me as a Zapotec woman, sure, I'm Mexican because I was born in the Mexican Republic, but the world does not know I speak another language. I speak Zapotec. And the world does not know that in Mexico, there are 68 indigenous language families that totals 360 something plus indigenous languages that are spoken in Mexico. And it's not only Spanish. So when people talk about migration of Mexicans to the US, they usually tend to forget indigenous people. The migrants, indigenous people from Oaxaca, from Chiapas, from Guerrero, and other parts of Mexico, including northern Mexico, which a lot of people think that there's no indigenous people there, to, like Raramuris in Chihuahua, there's indigenous people in Sonora, the Yaquis, right? So there's indigenous people throughout Mexico. And that label, it's deadly in our case. For example, a woman goes to a hospital, there's an assumption that she's a Latina or that she's Mexican. She's giving instructions on how to give a medication to a baby. She doesn't do it properly. This leads her the removal of her children being sent to foster care. And it wasn't that she didn't understand, it's the fact that she wasn't giving the instructions in Spanish. Or in the case that you're detained by the police and you don't know, or they don't know that you speak another language, and your Miranda rights get violated, right? So as not existing in numbers and as being labeled as Latinos, it causes a lot of pain in our families, in our communities. A little bit before I got on this call, I had a call from San Bernardino County. They are looking for Mixteco. There's 2 kids detained. They're like, well, isn't it a version of Spanish? I mean, isn't it related to Spanish? So this categorization and labeling has an impact on it. And that's how.
And there's no recognition that there's other languages other than Spanish being spoken throughout Mexico, but also in Central America, Guatemala, and other countries. And so they're like, you speak Spanish, and they're just giving that. Just giving you talked about immigration really briefly. The last several years, there's the hot topic around immigration has been unaccompanied minors, as well as children separated from their parents or other family members at the border, the deaths of children on the border. This has been frontline news. Can you tell us how are indigenous migrants impacted by our immigration policies? Because again, everybody's being put under that category of Latinx migrants.
Well, like I said, the case that I was talking about earlier, these are 2 kids that are trying to reunite with their parents, I believe with their parents, and they are stuck somewhere. We don't know where yet. We're going to find out tomorrow. Where are they? What exact Mixteco do they speak? because then there's Mixteco from Puebla, Mixteco from Guerrero, Mixteco from Oaxaca. We don't know their age because they can communicate with them, so just like these two kids, the case that we're handling today, there's hundreds of them throughout the border, not only from Oaxaca, but from Guerrero, from Guatemala, from different parts of Mexico. And not being able to get an interpreter or not being able to understand these processes in your language, it leads, I mean, for you to get an asylum case or refugee status is already very limited, but not understanding and not going through the process in your language make it leaves it at a zero possibility, right? So again, it has consequences. That this label has consequences, and for us, we've been pushed to, in order to integrate and not to deal with the racism that comes with saying I'm indigenous, I'm Zapotec. Nobody wants to be in the losing team, right? So that this is what it boils to. So a lot of us, when we get to this country, we automatically say, sure, I guess I'm Latino, because this is what everybody's saying. I guess I'm Mexican. And I've encountered so many families that they're like, I don't not speak Spanish very well, but I'd rather just use Spanish because the way they look at me, the way they treat me for speaking another language in hospitals, in courts, I don't want to go through that, So these are some of the consequences, but the immigration process, like the 4 years that we had, a lot of the families did not have their language access rights, and their human rights were constantly violated because they weren't given an adequate interpreter in the detention centers in other areas. We're hopeful that with this new administration, some things could be changed. Hopeful, not that the changing of administration gives us some hope. We don't know if it's going to happen, right? Because
well, I wanted to just, for our viewers who may not know, back in 2018 and early 2019, we had at least 6 children die while they were in ICE border and Customs and Border Patrol custody. And it's important for folks to know that those were, I think 5 out of those 6 were Indigenous children. They did not speak Spanish. They spoke another language. And so I really want to underline that piece about what you're saying, that it can be deadly, right? And have very dire consequences. I know that in your work as an interpreter, you were talking to me about a family whose child was just born, and they were going to actually have an operation regarding their genitalia, where the parents did not understand what was happening. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I could tell you it's exactly that, right? I noticed that their Spanish was very limited. I asked, what language do you speak? And then they said, well, I speak Zapoteco. I'm like, I speak Zapoteco. What pueblo are you from? They tell me, I know immediately it's not a match. You try your best in an institution to get them an interpreter, but there's no interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
So they go.
How many variants of Zapoteco exist?
Well, I think they say, the linguists say it's over 100. And in my region, I only understand fully, and I can only interpret like 1 or 2 variants at the most. I could get by just like, tengo hambre, I'm hungry. If I go to a plaza in another pueblo in the Sierra, in certain parts of the Sierra, but I wouldn't understand the whole Sierra Zapotec, right? So I understand a few pueblos surrounding, like, to get by, but to interpret in an institution like a hospital or like a court or in front of a judge, an immigration judge, I wouldn't, except for the variants that I quite understand. And this is the many cases. I was in court last week in a court in Northern California. The whole morning was with people that spoke another language. And they called me. They're like, Zapoteco. We need a Zapotec interpreter. Do you know what pueblo are they from? No, it's just Zapotec. Isn't it just a variant of Spanish? The judge was amazing. When I told her, Your Honor, I don't speak this language. Can we ask the defendant where are they from in order to get you the right interpreter? The judge said, I need to be educated. Please email me, because this is the 3rd time you come and we have the wrong Zapotec. It is not the judge's fault. It is the people at the interpreting office that do not want They do not want to do the legwork to find out what language or what variant of Zapotec, what variant of Mixteco or Triqui or whatever language it is that they need, you know? So I so there's a lot of work to be done in a lot of cases that as CIELO we have to be witness of violation of human rights
Mhm.
because there's
And
someone in that institution unwilling to take that extra step to provide a person an interpreter or to inform themselves that not all Mexicans speak Spanish.
right. Well, I want to we're going to go back to the language justice piece in a second, but I would love for you to talk about, you're in South Los Angeles, which a lot of people know was the epicenter of the so-called war on drugs, and that disproportionately affected Black communities living in South LA. And now South LA has a lot of indigenous people living mostly from Southern Mexico, if I understand correctly. And there's a link around the war on drugs and why people are leaving their hometowns. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Well, I would have to say I live in South Central. I do not want to call it South LA because this neighborhood has a lot of history of resistance of our Black relatives. There was an uprising here in 1992. I was already living here, you know, and as people always think South Central is a bad place. You know what? It's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful place. I know my neighbor Carter. He's an amazing neighbor. I know the other neighbors. We all know each other. We watch each other because, you know, and yeah, we have to deal with the shootings that happen. You know, at midnight, you know, you hear the LAPD helicopters all the time. Yes, that is something that we have to deal with. But South Central is a beautiful neighborhood, resilient, resistant. You know, always struggling, but you know, I'm a proud South Central woman. And yes, a lot of indigenous people live here now. Speaking of which, guess what? Can you hear the helicopter? They just um they're hanging out again. um but you know, a lot of my community live here in South Central. We moved here after 1996, after that famous legalization, and a lot more people live here now. Like we know, like I can't tell you where exactly I live. For those people that know where the pink house is, you know. But the next block, we know that there's people from a neighboring pueblo. The following house, the house in front, there's a lot of Oaxaqueños and a lot of indigenous people from Guatemala. And you know, the war on drugs, yeah, it impacts us daily to this day. It hasn't changed here in South Central. You know, it's a direct impact on us. Hearing those helicopters, the shootings that happen. This is the war on drugs, but I don't call it the war on drugs. This is the war on poor working class indigenous people and Black people.
And can you talk a little bit about how that war on drugs, though, internationally, then actually pushes indigenous people out of their hometowns?
Well, a lot of indigenous people live in natural resources. And one of the things is that transnational companies are after natural resources, right? And what best tool that they have is that the war in drug, the pretext, like they're fighting drug lords. In the case of, for example, Verapaz, Guatemala, that's one of the cases. It's palm oil. But under the pretext of the war on drugs, they're pushing out the communities. In the case of Colombia, in the case of Oaxaca, the war on drugs is pushing us out, and then transnational companies come and take over our lands, our water. And then when we get here, we criminalize, and then we end up in neighborhoods like South Central, like Westlake, where the war on drug continues. And I think for people that are more interested on the war on drugs and the impact on indigenous people, it's really good that you follow Dawn Paley. She has done a thorough investigation of an amazing work that she's doing on educating and informing how the war on drugs impacts indigenous community, but also how it's a tool for transnational companies that are after our natural resources, after our mining, after our water, after our lands. So I think that's very important. But we are surviving the war on drugs on daily. Back home, here. We get detained at the detention center. We end up living like neighborhoods like South Central, where the war on drug continues on us on a daily basis.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the language justice piece. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about what is it that you're doing? So there's just that, okay, one is people are failing to recognize that there are more languages than just Spanish in Mexico and Central America, and I'm sure in other places. So what are you doing? Talk about your training program and why it's so important for Indigenous people to be doing this type of interpretation.
Well, a lot of us, we act on the lack of information, right? Some of us don't know what I could always tell you, like when I came here, I didn't know there were other people, that there were that there were buildings instead of rivers. And sometimes we act on that. So for us, it's very important to educate and inform people about the causes of migration of Indigenous people. If you're growing up by a river, if you're growing up in like a place where there's so many trees that you could be freely, why would you even leave, right? Like only rich people live in those areas here in the US. So we want to educate and inform people, like we're not here by choice. And some of us probably came here for economic reasons, but a lot of us are a lot of Indigenous people are environmentally being pushed out, like all the lands that are being taken away, all the land defenders that are being killed. People have to leave their countries of origin in order to survive. So we want to educate people about that. Like, it's not that we just one day grab our stuff and decide to cross this murderous border and figure out and find out if we die or not. No. We are being pushed out of our lands. So I think that program that we have about education and the cultural awareness program, it has some results. Like we've seen it, like with one of the institutions that takes these courses very often is the Los Angeles Police Department. And we've seen some changes. We've seen some changes in them knowing what population are they patrolling in Westlake, what population are they patrolling in South Central. Of course, it is the police will always be the police, and we're very conscious of that. But we're making that push, like, hey, there's a group of people in the Rampart Division that speaks 15 indigenous languages. There's 15 indigenous languages spoken in the Rampart Division area, like Quiche, Cachiquel, Mije, Chinanteco, and they didn't know that, but now they do. And now they carry language cards where they could call and say, hey, I need an interpreter in Quiche. I need an interpreter in Mije. So those are that's part of our education program that we're doing.
Great, thank you so much. And then I'm going to zero in a little bit more on Los Angeles and your LA-based work. But before we go there, I wanted to just, I accompanied CIELO to Mississippi in 2019 after there was an ICE raid in central Mississippi. And what we found there were folks who are working in the poultry factories. Many of them were Indigenous, and even the people who live there, who were advocates, actually did not know much about that. Again, they were like, oh, they speak another, they call it a dialect of Spanish, et cetera. And so can you tell us maybe, so people get a sense, what are the major cities that across the country or towns or areas where there are like large amounts of Indigenous migrants that we could be mistaking as Latinx or Hispanic or however people categorize them?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Well, our allies and our relatives in the immigrant rights movements and the labor rights movements, they also don't recognize our existence as Indigenous people. I've spoken to labor leaders, I've spoken to immigrant rights leaders, and it's like this idea, like, hey, you need to assimilate and you need to integrate, leave that Indian out of you. It's constant that push that they always say. One very important leader told me one day, you know what, Odilia, I don't think of you as an Indigenous person. I think of you as a very smart Mexican woman. And and I'm glad you brought this up because I wanted to touch on that. Like all these labor movements, all these immigrant movements, we need to still do a lot of work. Just like for me, it doesn't make sense that LAPD is able to sit down for hours and take a training, on indigenous migration because they had consequences. They had killed someone, they killed Manuel Jimenez Chum in order to be able to have this conversation. But I can have this with my relatives in the immigrant movements. And then, like your experience in Mississippi with Claudio was, they didn't know that we spoke another language. They didn't know that there's more than 20 indigenous languages in Guatemala, more than 60 in Mexico, so they don't know. And this is the importance of our work about educating about the diversity of Latin America, but also how do you become an ally. And there's indigenous people in New York, in California, Oregon, Washington, Nebraska, North Carolina, Alaska, Hawaii. We are all over the place, and people need to know that we have human rights and that we're human and that we exist, and that they need to know that we speak a different language, we eat differently. Not all Mexicans listen to mariachi. We don't listen to mariachi, at least I don't.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from the chat. So Gerald Lenoir is asking, where can we find more information on the war on drugs?
You go find it. Follow Dawn Paley, Paley. She's doing amazing work on the impacts of the war on drugs in indigenous communities. Also, there's this beautiful book, amazing book called Chasing the Scream, that is written by Johanna Harris. It also gives you a very detailed, a lot of details about the war on drugs on people on developing countries, but also like how we humanely see drug addicts, right? How we make a change on how we view people with addictions and how it's linked to depression. It's a beautiful book to read, and I think we need to inform ourselves about this and how this impacts us daily, because we might not know and we might not feel it, but when you live in South Central, you know what the war on drugs is.
Great. I think yes, go ahead.
It's not a war on drugs. It's a war on people, poor people, Black people, indigenous people, working class.
Thank you. And we have another question as well. Thank you. Yes, the war on drugs. I think we had a question by Sue Ratner. Are there petitions we can sign on the issue of language justice?
No, we don't have a petition currently. We're working on some policy work with CIELO. And of course, Xiomara will be involved because she didn't say this, but I will say it. She's part of our board at CIELO. So.
Great. Thank you. Well, I just wanted to just say that, we're seeing out of Los Angeles there in the last month, right, post-holiday, there's been an upsurge of over 1,000%. And again, only naming Latinx communities in terms of who's being infected by COVID and also dying of COVID-19. Tell us a little bit about the impact, but also what are you doing about it? Tell us about it's the Undocu Indigenous Fund, Indigenous Undocu Fund.
Well,
sorry.
We were just reflecting on this with the team yesterday because we lost a dear friend due to COVID complications. And when I saw the death, tolls that they give you at the end of the day from LA County Department of Health, I said my friend would have never said he was Latino or he was Guatemalan. He used to call himself Quiche, the Rey Quiche. I am Quiche. But he went on the stats as just another Latino. And for us, that was very tragic because not even in death are we recognized as indigenous people, as Zapotecs, as Quiche. Every night I look at those numbers and I know somebody that had died of COVID or complications of COVID. Friends of mine have died. Now, he's not my first friend to die of COVID complication. And I'm like, this is just inhumane for us not to even in these numbers able to say who we are. But, and actually my friend that passed, Policarpo, he was one of the few first people to do with us videos to talk about COVID prevention. But he was also working at the court, so it's complicated. But for us, it was very important. Like when people started calling our office and said, "What are we gonna do? We're jobless. We don't have work. The restaurants are closing. Is CIELO gonna do something?" We started looking for funds. We got 5,000, then 10,000, then 25,000, and we're like, okay, this is all we got. And we created the Undocu Indigenous Fund, and we issued checks of $400. And then the LA Times cut off the story, printed it, and then somebody called and was like, "Hey, here's $200,000 for you on Undocu Indigenous Fund." And then we got featured in Vogue, and then somebody, here's another 200,000, to the point that we closed January with $1.5 million distribution of funds to Indigenous people. And through that distribution, we found out that there's 18 Indigenous languages spoken in LA County. Wow. Which is beautiful. And nobody knows that because we're Latinos, right? So those funds have been distributed. We're starting a second phase of that fund that we're going to continue funding, and we're still fundraising, because the first phase, some people had savings. Restaurants it was back and forth. It wasn't that cold. But once November, December, January hit, people had moved out of their homes. Some of them have their phones disconnected. I saw some people in court because the children weren't performing at the level that they should. The domestic violence increased. More and more Indigenous people got infected. I think at one point I want to come to Facebook, because every time I open it, the dancer had died. The people that did the rosary had died. Another dancer, a musician, like everyone that we knew, that we had seen, that we had interacted with, was taken by COVID. It was just very tragic. But in our team, we haven't had time to mourn our friends, our dancers, because we keep up this fast pace of continuing fundraising, because we know people are having food insecurities, people are having housing insecurities. We have not had, my mom was in the hospital with COVID, my dad had COVID, my sister, but none of us have had. Every single one in the staff has had someone with COVID. Two of our staff member became COVID positive. Well, we haven't had the time. I think once this kind of settles, we're going to collapse for a few weeks and just sleep, because we haven't had time to mourn. We haven't had time to cry. We haven't had time just to process all this pain that we're experiencing as being at the front line for during COVID for Indigenous communities, but at the same time, we are here to serve, and we gladly do it. But I think hopefully things will change soon, where we could cry a few days.
Great. Thank you so much. I thank you for your work that you're doing, for continuing to educate us who, like, we're socialized actually to not see indigeneity. And I can say that working in immigrant rights for a long time, I can recognize there was places where I just didn't understand why this person couldn't express themselves, something so simple. So I just want to thank you for all your work. I also want to just let people know, check out mycielo.org if you want to donate to the work. A lot of the donations that have been given to CIELO are merely for the mutual aid, and they actually don't cover overhead costs. And so if you want to support this work, and I know that you're doing that work not just in LA, but all over the country. You're also helping other groups, supporting them. There's groups in the Bay Area, in Central California, and also in Washington, D.C. and other places. So I want to thank you again, Odilia, for being on the program today. And I want to thank our viewers. Please join us next Wednesday again at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern Time for our next Frontline Dispatches. And with that, I bid you everybody good night.
Good night.